The London system is an opening that can allow us to get a very solid position, but it is not an opening that is free of traps or aggressive ideas. So in today's video we're going to see some very interesting traps that white can set up along the way, and these traps can work particularly well against very natural moves played by black. So let's start with the first trap. After d4, knight to f6, bishop to f4, we get the London system. As the name goes, in most lines, white moves can almost be played automatically. The bishop goes to f4, the pawns normally go to e3, c3, this knight normally develops to d2, and the other knight goes to f3. So here d5 is a very common way by black to play against a London, and after e3, one idea is to go e6. We're gonna see some ideas where black develops the bishop early on, but e6 is even more common. And after knight d2, c5, and c3, we get this very common pawn structure. And after knight to c6, knight g to f3, bishop to d6 is a very common way to develop the bishop, inviting white to trade bishops. But here we're gonna play the move bishop to g3. If black ever takes on g3, we take with the h-pawn and we activate the rook. And after black castles, bishop to d3, one common idea by black is to play the move queen to e7. By the way, just in case that you're not very familiar with the London, if black ever takes on d4, we take with the e-pawn, and then we also get the e-file to control on e5. For example, after we castle, we might bring a rook to e1, and we have even more control over the e5 square. But after the move bishop to d3, queen to e7 is an interesting move by black. So here natural moves for us will allow black to have an easy play because black wants to go e5. For example, after we castle, black can take on g3 or even e5 straight away, and black has a very decent position here. So whenever black threatens e5, we need to be a bit careful. If we want to fight for an advantage, then the move knight to e5 is quite interesting. First of all, black has to be a bit careful about taking on e5. Bishop takes e5 is playable, but knight takes e5 is really bad, because after we take on e5, we're forking the knight and the bishop, so we're winning a piece. But here the move knight to d7 is the most common move, which might be playable, but black has to be very careful, because here we're gonna capture on d7, and just to show you how hard this can be, the best move in this position is to take with the queen on d7, which is definitely not the most natural move in the position. Taking on d7 with the bishop is definitely more natural, trying to develop the bishop and connect the rooks. But here we're gonna take on d6, and after black takes on d6, d takes e5. Here at the very least, we're winning a pawn. Here black has to move the queen, for example, go into c7 and try to claim compensation for this pawn. Because after black takes on c5, out of nowhere we have this very nice sacrifice on h7, bishop takes, and after king takes, queen to h5, king to g8. Now we go knight to e4, taking advantage of the pin on the d-pawn, so black cannot capture on e4 without losing the queen, and we are attacking the queen. So the idea is to follow up with knight to g5 and try to give checkmate to black's king. Amazingly, white already has a winning position here. In the model game, black tried queen to c4, which is an interesting try to prevent white from castling, but white still has a very strong initiative after knight to g5, planning to give a checkmate, so black has to move the rook to give some air to the king. But here after queen takes, king to h8 and queen to h5, after king to g8, at the very least, white could give perpetual check, but white can play for more after rook to d1. White is trying to activate the rook on the d-file, and there might even be some ideas to go h4 and rook to h3. That's why black tried e5, trying to control h3, but now after queen to f7, king to h8, now this pawn on d5 is loose, so white tried e4, the pawn on d5 is pinned, so white is going to win even more material while still having his attacking chances. The second trap also involves a sacrifice on h7, after d4, d5, bishop to f4, knight to f6. The move order here is not particularly important. e3, c5, c3, knight to c6, knight to d2, e6, knight g to f3, bishop to d6. Here we're gonna play bishop to d3 as we discussed, and after black castles and bishop to d3. Another idea that black might try is to go b6. This is a very natural move, trying to develop the bishop on c8, which is locked in, and here we're gonna play the very interesting move e4. Now this position should not lead to an advantage for white, but black has to find the very weird move here, bishop to e7. So white's idea was to go e5, forking the bishop and the knight, so bishop to e7 anticipates this idea, and here we have a complicated but balanced position. But more natural, particularly if you didn't study this position, is to trade pieces on e4. After d takes, knight takes, and bishop takes, we're repeating the knight on c6, and this position is already becoming tricky for black. After bishop to b7, d takes c5 is another interesting move, inviting black to go wrong. Here we have pressure on d6, so black has to go bishop takes c5. If black trades on g3, we take with the pawn, and now black is in no time to take on c5 because we have pressure on h7. And after bishop takes e5, queen to a4 is really putting pressure on black's position. Here the best move is to go rook to c8, and after rook to d1, queen to e7 is holding black's position together, although white's position looks more pleasant. But here black might try to go queen to c8, trying to keep an eye on the knight, the bishop. The rook also controls a7, so your opponent might definitely play this move, which is a very solid one. But now here again we have another sacrifice on h7, bishop takes h7, and after king takes, queen to h4. If the king goes to g6, after queen to g5 and queen to h5, we can drive it back to g8. Or if the king goes back to g8 straight away, knight to g5 is again very strong, planning to give a checkmate. And if the rook moves, now we give a check on h7 and we collect the pawn on g7. Now we attack f7, and after rook to f8, here we castle, and in fact white already has a crushing position. White has 2 pawns for the minor piece, but white has all the attack. Just to show you a nice idea, if black tries to defend on f7, planning to go rook to g8, here white has many moves, but a move that I really like is knight takes e6. The pawn on f7 is pinned, and after king takes, rook h to e1, here we're gonna give a very quick checkmate with 2 rooks and a queen. So the move queen to c8 is really bad because bishop takes h7 is just crushing. And by the way, if you want to know more about this type of sacrifice, which is called the Greek gift sacrifice, I have a separate video where I analyze this sacrifice very deeply, so you might want to check the link in the description. In the next trap, we're going to see a position where black tries to develop the bishop on c8 early on, after d4, d5, bishop to f4, knight to f6, knight to f3, c5, e3 and knight to c6, knight b to d2 and bishop to g4. So black is developing the bishop and pinning the knight. And here we have a very interesting idea, which is to go c3 and after e6 go queen to a4. So we break the pin on the knight, and we have ideas to develop the bishop to b5 and to another square, as we'll see. So here the most common move is a losing move. Just want to mention that here black should play bishop takes f3. In that case we get the 2 bishops and a very comfortable position. Or knight to d7, which is definitely not a natural move here. After knight to d7 we can play bishop to b5. We still have some pressure, although black should hold with correct play. But after the most natural move, bishop to d6, which is a very common idea for black in London to challenge this very strong London bishop. Now here we're not going to play bishop to g3 as we normally do, but here we have the very nice bishop to a6. Now this pawn is overloaded, defending the knight on c6, and black cannot defend it easily. For example, after rook to b8, we can take on d7 and then take on c6. Here we're even winning more material. If black takes on a6, now we're going to take on c6, and after king to e7, white is going to win material and even have a much better king. Here we could play queen to b7 before taking on a6, and after a move like queen to d7, trade, the queen is pinned, so black has to take with the king, so now we take on a6 with a check, and after king to e7, white has an extra pawn and a much safer king, so this is pretty much game over. So amazingly, black's position is falling apart. If black takes on f4, we can even play the intermediate move bishop takes b7, and a lot of black pieces are being attacked. So white is going to win the material black and even win more material. For example, after black castles, we can take on c6, and we're attacking on f4 and a8. Now, another way for black to develop the bishop is to go to f5, after d4, d5, knight to f3, knight to f6, bishop to f4, c5, e3, knight to c6, knight b to d2, bishop to g4 is an idea where black has to be careful bishop to f5 is another way to develop the bishop, which is also quite risky because here we're gonna take on c5. Very often this is not a very strong idea because after e6, black simply takes on c5 and we're giving away the center. But here we have the very strong move knight to d4, taking advantage of the placement of the bishop on f5. And here actually the relatively best move for black is to take on c5, allowing us to take on f5, and after pawn takes, we could play something like c3, we have the bishop pair, we can try to attack this pawn on d5, so we have some pressure here, although the position should be fairly balanced. Instead of taking on c5, taking on d4 is really bad because after we take, now we have an extra pawn. But another very common idea that black might try here is the move bishop to g6, and this is actually really bad because now we're gonna play the move bishop to e5, putting pressure on the knight on c6, and after black defends the knight, if black goes queen to c8, we can play the move b4, now that the knight on c6 is pinned, or after rook to c8, we have a forcing way to win the exchange. b4 is also quite strong here, but knight takes c6, d takes, and bishop to a6 is going to win an exchange. b8 is controlled, and after rook to a8 and bishop to b7, white is winning a full exchange. And before I move on to the last trap, if you want to improve at chess besides getting better in the opening, I have a free course that will provide you with a training plan for that, so feel free to check the link in the description. So in the last trap, after d4, knight to f6 and bishop to f4, fianchettoing the bishop by going g6 is also quite common. And after e3, bishop to g7, knight to f3, d6, knight b to d2, here h3 is a very common idea, giving a square for the bishop if it's ever attacked by the knight on f6. And here after knight b to d7, in this setup, the bishop normally doesn't go to d3 because black might have ideas to go e5 and e4, so here white normally goes bishop to e2. This is a very solid move that you can definitely play, but the move bishop to c4 is a very interesting move to set up a trap. So here black's main plan is to go e5, and the best move in the position here is to go queen to e8, which is probably not a very natural move for black if black is not familiar with this position. Now the idea is to support e5. But another seemingly similar idea is to go rook to e8, trying to support e5. But this is actually quite bad for black because after the shocking bishop takes f7 and king takes knight to g5, we're going to land a knight on e6. After king to g8, for example, king to f8 is even worse because knight to e6 gives a check. But even here, knight to e6 is a very pretty move. The queen on d8 is trapped, so white is going to get a decisive material advantage. So hope that you enjoyed these traps for white in the London system. If you want to learn how to play some very nice traps as black against the London system, I have another video about it that you might want to check on the right side. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.